Good afternoon, everybody. Absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon from a virtual webinar from Melbourne Law School. I'd like to commence by acknowledging that I work on the land of the Kulin people and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and their emerging leaders also, and a particularly warm welcome to any Indigenous people who might be joining us this afternoon. My name is Pip Nicholson and I'm the Dean at the Melbourne Law School, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome students, alumni, friends of the school, staff, engaged legal professionals for a discussion about leadership. In particular, our focus this afternoon is leading and managing in times of great uncertainty. I think everyone in the audience would recognise that leadership is about facilitating change, but perhaps you don't stop and think so often that management is distinguished from leadership, and it may in fact be about creating order, and both are critical skills in uncertain times, and our times are indeed uncertain. So thank you for joining me this afternoon, and I would now like to turn and briefly introduce my two wonderful guests. First, I'll introduce Joel Barolsky, Managing Director of Barolsky Advisors and also a Senior Fellow with us at Melbourne Law School. Joel is also an opinion writer for the Australian Financial Review. For the past 16 years, Joel has taught management for legal professionals subject at Melbourne Law School. He's also a consultant and advised over 100 of Australia and Asia's leading law and accounting and business advisory firms. He has also worked extensively with in-house counsel, legal teams, and presented at numerous Australian Corporate Council events. About 70% of Joel's clients are by word of mouth or repeats, and his specialisation, or what he's renowned for bringing to organisations, is strategy formulation and implementation. Joel, a really warm welcome to you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Pip. Thank you very much.
Great. Our second guest is the wonderful Dr Rodney Howard, a consultant at Cultivating Leadership, an organisation that supports leaders around the world to adapt and thrive in a changing world. Rodney sees himself primarily as a facilitator of individual and collective growth. Rodney has facilitated leadership and organisational development in global organisations and professional service firms for over 2 decades. Preferring to partner with clients over long periods, Rodney develops bespoke approaches that enable leadership development and cultural evolution to occur simultaneously. Rodney was a medical doctor for over a decade and facilitated or transitioned to facilitation, coach and education, and that particular career change was or reflected a deep desire to work specifically on issues of individual growth and organisational transformation. He's accredited with both the Leadership Circle and the Human Synergistic Suite of tools. Rodney is a certified coach with the Institute of Executive Coaching and Leadership and a certified Growth Ed coach. A warm welcome to you also, Rodney.
Thank you, Pip. Lovely to be here.
Great. Just before we kick off, I note this is the third in our leadership series, and as with all our practices, I invite you to pop your questions into the Q&A function and I'll curate them at the end. We're hoping to have some time for you, our wonderful audience, to be in conversation with these wonderful experts. I want to kick off by asking each of you, Joel and Rodney, to distinguish leadership and management for the audience.
I might have a first go at that and really draw in the work of John Cotter from Harvard Business School, where he talks about management being the processes and activities that bring order and predictability to a particular organization. So to help that organization run more efficiently and effectively, to have real discipline, to get, set up the systems, organize the various resources to deliver an outcome. In a sense, almost to create a well-oiled machine. But at the same time, most organizations are operating in an environment of change and flux. Things are happening all the time. This year, many organizations have faced the challenges of COVID-19. And so leadership is really around, the activities around, facilitating change, setting new directions, inspiring and motivating people towards a goal or a new goal. And so there's this aspect around leadership which is dynamic and facilitating and adapting the organization to changes in the environment. But at the same time, we also need a level of order to run the organization in a more efficient and effective way, and that really is partly the management function. So in a way, we need both, and we need both that consistency and predictability, but also the ability to change and move. But Rodney, what's some of your thoughts on the distinction between leadership and management?
Yeah, I'd build on what you've said, Joel. And like you, I've used John Cotter's model for a long time because it's so nice and so simple. And the simplistic way that I've sort of described it is management ultimately is around dotting I's and crossing T's, making sure people get paid when they're supposed to get paid, making sure that the boxes are filled and everything's in a spreadsheet. And for people who like order, and most of us like order, management is actually quite a comfortable activity a lot of the time because we make things neat and tidy. Leadership is really quite different. Leadership is ultimately about going into the future, going somewhere where we've not been before. And that inevitably means going somewhere new and different. And for many of us, that can immediately provoke a degree of anxiety. It can be a bit scary. It can be a bit worrisome, which is why leadership is so challenging. And then one of the things that I see commonly, I'm sure you've seen this as well, Joel, is that in organisations, and this happens a lot in law firms like lots of other organisations, people who are naturally very good at the discipline, so people who are good at being technical lawyers, are then promoted into leadership roles, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be good leaders. It simply means that they're good often at a certain discipline. And where, as you said, in COVID-19 right now, and what's that has done for our leaders, has taken them not just into a place whereby they're leading change into a future, but they're now leading change in a deeply uncertain and unpredictable environment. And that is stretching and challenging leaders right across the globe, as we've seen, just looking at the political framework in Australia today.
Yeah, exactly.
Does this not reference some of the work that's been done around the distinction between managing a complicated scenario and leading through complexity? And do we want to talk briefly around the difference between those and how they resonate or don't with the notion of leadership?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely analogy, Pip. And in many ways, you can make some analogies between the two things, right? So I'll just talk a little bit about this concept of complexity. I mean, one of the first gentlemen who brought this idea to us, a number of years ago, Dave Snowden, was one of the sort of the fathers of thinking around complexity. And he built a model which is now very well known around the world called the Cynefin model. And to make it really simple in terms of looking at the Cynefin model, he spoke about, one element which is highly predictable and another arena which is highly unpredictable. Now, we can make an analogy there in the world of management where things are ordered and tidy. There is a predictable way of looking at things and working out how things will play out. And his model really was about how we make decisions. So if we're in a certain context, what's the decision-making strategy that we use? And his idea was in the complicated world, which is ultimately the realm of most lawyers. That's the role of, technical competency. It's the role of the SME, the subject matter expert. It's the role of analysis and logical reasoning, deductive processing, where we come along and we take a whole lot of data, we analyze it, we settle it down, and we say, here's the answer. And it's logical, it's predictable, and it's patterned. And that's the sort of the idea of the complicated world. The complex world is unpredictable. We don't have patterns. We can't make sense of it in the same way. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Therefore, we are much more unsure and we feel unsafe. And what most of us do is we try and drag ourselves back into the complicated, patternated world where we can use logic and reasoning. The problem is, in the complex world, it actually doesn't work. And COVID-19 is a wonderful example of that. We're now in a global environment where we actually don't know what's going to happen in the next month, in the next 3 months, in the next 6 or 12 months. That is deeply uncomfortable for most of us, just in our human beingness. So now think of it being a leader of an organization or a government where you can't rely on expert advice because you don't really know if the scientists are going to give you the right information because they're over in the analytical world, but that's no longer enough. So we then have to find a new way of making sense and a new way of leading. And that is stretching most of our leaders dramatically. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Joel.
Look, it's support, just take another perspective. In preparation for today, I went back and sort of tried to find a definition of leadership. And the one that sort of resonated with me, it says that leadership is a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a goal. And if you just look at that first aspect around the process of social influence, what it's saying is that, you know, leadership often stems from the ability to influence others, not necessarily from authority. And particularly in a law firm context where you're dealing with a lot of peers, your ability to influence and shape the behavior of others is a critical part of the leader. But the complexity comes from dealing with people. Like, like the process of social influence, we're dealing with people and all the peculiarities and nuances of human behavior, their needs, their expectations, their fears, their desires, all of that. Everyone is different. And that's, and if you're leading a team of 2, okay, but if you're leading a team of 2,000, suddenly, the complexity around dealing with all those human needs and interactions, how they work individually, collectively, that's complex. And the leadership challenge sort of goes up.
I'll just add something to that, Joel, just before we move on. Pip, is that to make this a sort of more contextual for people to sort of resonate with in daily life, if we think about organizational systems, we might put in a new sort of technology system or a new platform or something that organizes us. So for example, right now lots of professional services firms are dealing with the challenge of moving into a post-COVID world. How do we now deal with the workforce where we know that from statistical data already out there, 70% of people don't want to return full-time. 70% of people inside professional services want to come back and work part-time, maybe 3 days a week. So, Joel and I are seeing, our clients, they're already doing things like having split teams. So a large litigation department of 50 people, they've got 25 people, on the floor and 25 people at home. They've never had to do that. They've got to work out all of their rotation systems. So the HR professionals are dealing with this. So example, you might put in a new, really well fandangled, IT system or platform to be able to, make it work. That's complicated.
Can we just tidy up a detail there, Rodney? It's come through the queries. Yeah. Is that people wanting to work part-time per se, so just a limited number of time a week, or they want to work part-time at home and part-time in the office whilst working full-time?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what you're seeing, Joel, but what I'm hearing is that from my clients, they've been surveying their people over the last 3 months, and right across the board, I'm hearing the average of around about 75% of staff do not want to return full-time. And this includes partners. This is partners right up and down the line, right? They want to come back around 3 days a week. But let me just finish.
I'm hearing something different. So, I mean, it's fine to disagree. But what I'm picking up is more that they want to return to work full-time, but want to work in a more flexible arrangement where, 60, 70% of their time is at the office in the city. and then, you know, the balance is either at home or in another environment which is productive. So to do a fair bit of...
Sorry, then, no, my apologies. People want to retain full-time work. My apologies if I've confused things, but
Yeah.
they absolutely want to go down to, you know, 1 to 2 days at home a week.
Yeah.
So
can I just, before we get too bogged down in where we want to work from, can I take us back to the changing nature of work, which is the broader issue that you've raised, Rodney, and ask you to reflect on the way in which law firms in particular are changing, and both structurally and in terms of practice, and what implications that has for management and leadership styles.
That's a big question.
Well, let's start with firms changing and then see where we go.
Yep.
I'm happy to have a first go at that, and you can look at it from a macro and a micro perspective. And at a big picture, you have a much more diverse workforce, both in terms of gender, in terms of you know, ethnicity, race, age. So you could find in a law firm now, or an in-house team, you know, 5 generations of people, you know, 3 or 4 different cultures, gender preference. I mean, there's a whole disability, there's a whole raft of different people with different needs. And that adds a level of complexity and challenge. There are major mental health issues. It's widely reported that the profession has mental health issues at least twice or even 3 times that of the general population. But more broadly, there's the nature of work and the role of technology in how work is done. That's, you know, changing by the minute. There's literally billions of dollars being invested in new legal technology, which is there to assist and aid in document preparation and advising, research, all the key functions of lawyers. But also in the organizations themselves, it's just much more competition. But at a micro level, there's also increased expectations that if, as a leader, if you're a team leader, you know, people are looking for a purpose, looking for some inspiration. They're looking for direction on their career. They're looking for clarity in terms of feedback. They're looking for, you know, real guidance and, you know, delegation with care and courage, you know, and providing a safe environment. And so the expectations at a day-to-day micro level are increasing all the time, but the sort of macro challenges within and structural changes are quite dramatic as well. And both of them, you know, these forces are, you know, put added demands for the leadership capacity. Organizations need to build that leadership muscle. I quite like the metaphor of a muscle. You know, it needs to become stronger. It needs to be, you know, being more enduring. And, you know, and traditionally law firms, in-house legal departments have been quite weak in terms of that leadership muscle. But some further thoughts from you, Rodney, on that?
Well, just to extend the thought that you were sharing there around leadership development and the way professional service firms and law firms are thinking about leadership. I think one of the big shifts that I've seen, particularly over the last 3 to 5 years, is that law firms have realized that skills development is no longer enough. So that, you know, we can skill lawyers up technically, we can skill them up in terms of some management capabilities and some basic leadership principles. But that really is a sort of a way of thinking about what I would call horizontal development. And I think what I'm seeing, particularly in some of the more evolved and, you know, mature organizations that are really pushing the boundaries, they're now recognizing that we need to move into what I would call vertical leadership development, which is more about the emotional maturity, the adult maturity, the ability to be able to take more perspective, to be able to have more social awareness, to be able to have more awareness of the role of the system, both for the society of the community of that organization, but also that's its role in the broader sector and community. I'm seeing much more preparedness to realize that there's a place for that now, and that is actually a critical enabler if an organization wants to actually remain competitive and push boundaries.
So can I ask a question around the structure of firms then? So Rodney, you're talking about the different approaches to fostering and developing leadership. But let's reflect for a moment. Are there particular features or structures in legal practice that embed managerialism rather than leadership, or tend to support a practice of management rather than leadership? I'm pitching to you on that.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's a preference over management over leadership. I actually think it's neither of those two. I think it's a preference for production. So the system has been set up to produce, to advise, to go and win work and deliver it. You know, that's its primary sort of raison d'etre at one level. And so the career structures, how people are rewarded, what gets measured, so much of it is around production. And so if you think about, you know, partners in a law firm or a general counsel in a legal team, you know, they have three roles. They're producers, managers, leaders. And, you know, the thing that gets, you know, the big, you know, what do they get their bonus on, or how do they get rewarded? It's on their production role. And if things get busy, what do they focus on? The production role. That's where they've mastered their craft. That's what they feel comfortable with. So, you know, it's the natural inclination is to go towards doing more production rather than management or leadership. And so, I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, because one view is, well, maybe law firms and legal organizations should hire more professional managers like a corporation does, who are full-time leaders and managers, and let them run the show. But actually, I think there's huge value in having the practitioners as leaders. And I think there's value in the partners being producer, manager, leaders. I just think they need to manage the tensions and the aspects of those three roles and get better at all three, and manage the, you know,
Is there not another element in there, Joel, as well, that it's a group of peers that are coming together? And how does that complicate the situation?
Well, and again, maybe Rod, you can comment, but it clearly from a, you know, going back to that idea of social influence, if you work in a corporate environment, you know, the corporate hierarchy, you know, you've got your CEO, and then you've got the direct reports and the direct reports to them. That is a very much sort of a command and control structure. In a law firm partnership where all partners are equals and peers, and often very good friends, and have a, you know, focus on collegiality and, you know, that sort of keeping things cordial. You know, how do you influence change? How do you get the organization, you know, all those people to move on a particular path, particularly if that's not overly, you know, comfortable or supported? You know, you want to make some significant change. You know, doing that in an environment where you don't have formal authority, but you have to use your sort of your influencing skills and your other forms of mobilizing change. You know, that's where it becomes even more important, or more challenging, but in a way almost more important.
Did you want to add to that, Rodney?
Yeah, I think you've encapsulated so nicely, Joel. And one of the things that I see is that in that structure that you've spoken about, in that sort of production mindset inside of a professional services firm, there's an identity structure that sits inside most lawyers, which primarily sees themselves as client service providers. And so you have a situation where you might have somebody who's in their mid-40s or even in their mid-50s, and their still dominant way of identifying their role is to serve clients and being a technical service provider and a lawyer. And if you think about somebody who's grown up in a corporate sphere, you know, from a very early age, in their 30s, in their late 30s, in their 40s, they're stepping up, taking broader roles, a team, then a larger team, then a department, then a larger department. And all the while they're being schooled in the idea that your identity is a leader of people and a leader of transformation and change. And so they grow up with that mindset and they see themselves in that way. I reflect on a person that I'm coaching at the moment who is the leader of a national Australian legal organisation. And we are having conversations about the struggle that he's having, being able to make choices that impact lifelong friends of his. And so the identity shift for him is, here I am as a client service provider, but now I'm leading this large organization and this enterprise. My identity says I'm a lawyer and I've now got this role of leadership, but somehow I've got to be able to step up onto a different balcony and go, I've now got an enterprise role. What do I look at and how do I see the world differently from this role overseeing a whole enterprise, as opposed to somebody just looking after a practice or a group and, you know, spending time with my mates who I've been doing law together with for 20 years. That's a very, very challenging transition for people to make. And so I think you've hit on a lot of the things that hold people back in leadership capability inside law firms, Pip, is the fact that they're all lawyers together, and a lot of them have not had experiences outside that. That's both a blessing, but it also can hold people back in terms of the way they make sense of their role and their identity.
It's really interesting, and it's got fascinating parallels, if I can say, with the sorts of challenges across universities, where we are also peer-based organisations. The collegiality of a body of people who come together to research and teach is well, in our case, it's very special, but it creates similar sorts of tensions if you're looking at making hard choices. Can I ask you both? We've talked.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Sorry, just one. I think there is one more really valuable point, and just about from an organisation design perspective, and that is, if you go into most law firms, the career structures and pathways are very defined around legal competence in a way. So people come in as a graduate, then they go to become a solicitor or a lawyer, then they, go associate, senior associate, partner. And, it's a very defined career path based on, assessment of legal skill, really, and capability, ability to advise. And there aren't many alternative career paths, for fast track leaders. You don't see, high potential 29-year-old lawyers becoming a practice group leader, whereas you would see that in a corporate environment. You would see, high potential people being, given the support and, and promoted, because of their potential to really be an effective leader of a bigger team. And it just doesn't happen easily within a law firm because there's such defined positions and roles, and the design of the organization doesn't enable it or facilitate it as well. So
can I ask you, generally, these reflections have been quite closely looking at the nature of the firm or the role of the in-house counsel. How easily or relevantly do these comments apply in the government sector, for example, or the not-for-profit sector?
Joel?
Look, my sense is that it depends on which part of government. So there's in government, there are these large in-house teams. So I did some work a few years ago with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT in Canberra, and was facilitating their sort of annual conference. And there were 90 lawyers in the meeting room. So there's a fairly large team of lawyers working in an in-house role for DFAT, and that's replicated across both at a federal and at a state level. And so those in-house lawyers are within a legal department, and sort of the parallels are quite strong. But there's a lot of thousands of lawyers who work in the public service, who don't have formal legal roles and have gone more into sort of policy roles and senior advisory roles that just happen to use their legal training. So, I mean, I think the idea of leadership capacity and potential is equally relevant in both those roles in the public service as with non-profits. Obviously, the agenda and the purpose is slightly different, and maybe that point we raised earlier around law firm has been focused on production. Well, maybe in a non-profit, the orientation is more around that organization's purpose and greater community role and objective, I suppose. So, but I think many of the aspects still apply. It's just there are some sort of contextual differences. But Rodney,
well, I think you made a comment that resonated with me in one of our earlier conversations, Joel, and I've seen this myself, that that whilst the dynamics of the organisations might be different, often it's the case that the people who go into leadership roles in in-house roles or government roles or not-for-profits actually come out of private law firms to begin with. So they take a lot of the learning and the mindset with them, and then they replicate it in those organisations. So and wherever they go, I think they still struggle to get away from that identity of being held to the nature of being a lawyer. And I see that in my old profession in medicine, I see it in accounting, I see it in law, I see it in engineering, I see it in academia. When you've got such a strong identity structure around that, it can be very difficult to get beyond. So I think there is an element of a pervasive nature of some of what we're speaking about, Pip.
Can I maybe shift the conversation a little and ask you to advise those who are with us this afternoon, how can they approach their own leadership development? What can people do to foster or seek to develop their own leadership?
I might kick off by just telling a little story around that. And Pip mentioned that I teach a course at the Melbourne Law School called Management for Lawyers. And each year I present the course, I get a guest speaker, usually a managing partner, to talk a bit about their own leadership journey and the challenges of the role and so on. And 2 years ago, I invited Chris Freeland, who's the regional managing partner of Baker McKenzie, and one of my students asked him this exact question. What has been the most impactful aspect of your leadership journey? And interestingly, he mentioned Danny Gilbert. Danny Gilbert is the founder of a firm called Gilbert & Tobin, and he's one of Australia's most notable law firm leaders. And Chris worked at Gilbert & Tobin as the chief operating officer for a period of time, but has maintained a strong relationship with Danny. And he said, Danny Gilbert's been a mentor for him and been someone that he could bounce ideas off, be a confidant, an advisor, someone who had sort of his interests at heart, but didn't necessarily work in the organization. And sort of having that kind of person in his life has been so meaningful and transformational. And his advice to my class and to the students in the room was who in your circle could provide that kind of mentoring role, or be that person where you can go and sound them out if you're looking to do a course or looking to deal with a particular challenge, or advance your career in some way, but just to talk things through and provide that wise counsel. So I mean, it's a big question, but I thought I'd share that story because it really resonated with the students and it resonated with me, and thought about who's in my circle to provide some of that mentoring and that sounding board. So it's a simple thing and a simple idea, but it can be incredibly powerful.
Do you agree, Rodney?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I think about your question around leadership, Pip, I'd say a couple of things. One is I think there is a distinction between skills development and growth, and they're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. Skills development is important. There are certain skills that we all need to master in terms of management capabilities, getting organised, time management, delegation, and so on. But that doesn't mean leadership. And when we think about leadership, we're really talking about our ability to be able to manage our internal state and then create a positive influence and an influence that engages people around us. So ultimately they want to follow us and join us and come with us. And so this concept of leadership development being an inside out journey is one that I think is a really important one. And so if I'm thinking about leadership development with people, there's an element there about being eternally curious. And that curiosity is both inward and outward. And so self-awareness is absolutely critically important, and how we start to develop that, get more emotional awareness, get more better ability to be able to have awareness and manage our own internal mental state and emotional state. And how then do we show up to the world around us? Because the more we can manage that and look after that, the more attractive we are and the more capable we'll be as a leader. And then absolutely, as Joel said, there is no better way of learning to lead than finding good role models and good mentors and good people to guide you. And the last thing I'd say is, I think you asked us a question, Pip, whether leadership is born or made at one stage, which was a great question in itself. I'm certainly the opinion that for most of us, leadership is made, in the sense of it's about the opportunities that are either created for us or create for ourselves. And if I had a recommendation to people, it would be any opportunity you get to take some responsibility, to actually, add a bit more leadership influence in the role that you play or in the organisation that you're a part of. Take it, jump at it, run with it, and have a go at it, because then you show yourself and you show others that you've got some strength and some aptitude in that arena.
Yeah. Okay, so that's an answer that spans the most sort of basic step. Acquire a mentor at different moments, at different times, and perhaps different people along the way. How do people do that? Let's just start there, and then I'll come back to some of the other things you said.
I'll say a couple of things to that. I don't think I could count how many times I've been involved with large organisations putting structured mentoring programs in place, or structured coaching programs, partners coaching, special counsel, mentoring senior associates, and so on. And they are really important and they're very valuable. But ultimately, I think what they do is they provide a really valuable service for people who struggle to be able to build innate mentoring relationships to themselves. And I'm not saying they're not valuable, because they are, but there's no doubt in my mind that anytime I've ever asked anybody who was the best mentor for you, they will always say, oh, it was somebody that I just started working with years ago and I really liked them and they really liked me, and we just hit it off and we started hanging out together. So, if I had a recommendation about finding a good mentor, it's people who you like and enjoy being with, people who you respect and admire, and fundamentally, people whose values are aligned with yours. Because if those things are in place, you will want to actually learn with them and spend time with them. And osmotic learning through mentoring is a wonderful thing. The last thing I'd say is that I've seen many people start to move a relationship, a mentoring relationship, into something that they think might be more formal, but it doesn't necessarily work so well. So if I said to you, Pip, hey, Pip, will you be my mentor? That immediately moves into a sort of a formal expectation arena. Whereas if I said to you, hey, Pip, I really like, listening to some of your stories. Would it be okay if we had lunch, 2 or 3 times a year? We might find that both a bit more natural. So I suppose I just ask people to think about people that you like, people you can spend natural time with, and they, in my experience, they are ultimately the best mentors. I'm interested, Joel, what's your sense of it?
Yeah, look, I'm just also thinking at a personal level, it's hard, and I'm reflecting on some people I know, but if I had to offer some advice for someone perhaps in the early part of their career, and that is potentially to widen their circle slightly, or widen their network. So I'm just in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of 3 or 4 people who joined a non-profit organization and actually went onto their advisory board and did some initial, volunteer work there, and then got onto their board. And actually, in all those cases, one of the other members of that board became a mentor. So it was outside their current organizational frame and the people they mix with, but there were a couple of people they connected with through that non-profit organization that they developed that kind of relationship with. So if there's no obvious candidates, then maybe look to widen the circle slightly, and go into an area that there's some personal interest and passion, and often you'll find like-minded people in those circles. So it takes a bit of effort. You can't just sort of sit there and wait for the phone to ring, I suppose, or someone to knock on your door. There has to be a level of proactivity about it, but there is the potential, but it might need to come from non-traditional circles, not just within your current firm or your current your current place.
So coming back to some of the other strategies, for want of a better word, that you suggested, Rodney, fostering your own curiosity, looking for greater self-awareness, looking to come to understand yourself, both the strengths and the vulnerabilities with which we all travel. When does a legal practitioner or a young professional start to focus on the development of their leadership, whether it's through mentorship or through any of the other strategies that you raised, Rodney?
It's a great question. And I'd start by saying I'm going to make a distinction between what I call big L leadership and small L leadership. With all due respect, Pip, you're a big L leader because you're the dean of the law school, right? So you have a title, you have authority, you actually make material decisions that impact people's lives, and you influence culture, and you lead a whole department and a school. But for people who are in the early part of their career, they might not have big L leadership because they don't have a title or a role, but they have small L leadership in terms of leading themselves and bringing the best of themselves to the workplace every single day. So, if I think about small L leadership, when is the best time to start doing that? My answer is right now, today, and starting to get more understanding and awareness of who are we as a person, what makes us tick, where are we and who are we at our best? How can we be the best of ourselves every single day, and how can we show up in ways that bring the best of us to organisations and to life? And how can we find people who can help us on that journey, whether they be mentors, whether they be coaches? The wonderful thing about so many organisations now is, because we've realised a lot of this, and as I said, over the last 3 to 5 years, I've seen a lot of change and shift in the way that lawyers are trained and developed. I'm seeing lawyers now at much younger ages exposed to ways of getting to know themselves better, whether it be doing Myers-Briggs or doing self-awareness or doing 360s or having feedback. That stuff didn't happen 10 years ago, and that's absolutely wonderful. So I think anything that you can do that starts to help you get more awareness of who you are and what's important to you, what are your values, what's your sense of purpose, what fires you up and gets you going, how you can discover places and ways where you can be and do more of that, you're going to be a better person in the world, you'll be a better leader, you'll have more influence, and ultimately you'll enjoy your life and your career more when you start to follow that path.
Okay, I'm going to put one more question to you, and then I think we need to start turning to the questions that are coming in from our participants. Is there a role for universities here in contributing to the leadership capacity of lawyers?
Joel?
But most yes and no. I mean, I think that there is a critical role for perhaps at a graduate level, where people have decided that they do see themselves as advancing within their organizations and wish to acquire certain leadership skills. So, I mean, some for example, go on and enroll in an MBA, and the lawyer MBA model is quite an interesting one. And my experience with that generally is that for those seeking to become sort of high-level commercial advisors, the MBA provides a degree of sort of commercial literacy that's really helpful in augmenting a person's advisory capability. They understand their clients better, in a sense, by doing an MBA. Does it actually necessarily build their leadership skill and capability and build that muscle? I think the jury is mixed to do an MBA just for that sort of leadership aspect. So I think there is a role, and I mean, I'm working with the law school at the moment, and maybe Pip, you can talk about that. We're working in partnership with the Melbourne Business School, currently looking at a new set of coursework programs in legal leadership, potentially to be launched next year. But it's much more tailored towards those in legal organizations. much more focused and condensed than, say, like a full-blown MBA, which is, 20 subjects and, quite an extensive course, and many subjects that aren't that relevant to professional service environments. So we're looking at that.
But maybe we could reflect that particular piece of work comes out of long-standing engagement with firms and lawyers practicing across the country who've talked about the increasing complexity of working in a range of legal sector occupations, and the fact that technical upskilling isn't the challenge. It's challenge to understand both context and then a set of skills around leadership. And indeed, we're going to do further development work, and let's see where we land next year, but I would hope we land with something. Look, I've got some fantastic questions coming through the chat, and I'd like to share them with you. One is taking us back to this question of mentorship. Can you speak to a difference between sponsors and mentors, and the critical role of sponsors, particularly as people are more advanced in their careers?
I think it depends what we mean by the actual term sponsorship, Pip.
I don't have a definition for you, so maybe define it however you'd like to.
Certainly what I see a lot of for people, and I think the sponsorship, well, it becomes more important once you start to move up the tree a little bit, let's say. But even for people moving, from a senior lawyer role into a senior associate role, etc., special counsel partner, junior partner, senior partner, that they will often have somebody who sponsors them, who takes them under their wing, who shepherds them, who guides them. Think about the classic example of the more senior M&A partner who's got the junior lawyer coming through and gets right through special counsel and then comes into junior partnership. Then there's a 10-15 year gap, and then over time the senior partner continues to sponsor, the senior partner fades away, and the partner takes. That's a classic example of sponsorship, if you like, and that's a critically important role, and I would absolutely encourage people to ensure that you have meaningful sponsorship in organisations. I have seen certain situations where people have had a fairly limited exposure, and so they might only be exposed to their sponsor and spend too much time with their sponsor, and therefore they're not getting broad enough range of influence. And I absolutely accept Joel's point. The number of times I've encouraged people in professional services firms to find mentors outside the law. So yes, there's the role of the sponsor, critically important, and I think there's a distinction between a sponsor and a mentor, and often the best mentors are people who are a little bit distanced from you. There's a little bit of a gap. So, I'm always recommending to people, for example, in a large law firm, if you're being sponsored by somebody who's in your group, see if you can find a mentor in another group. If you're in litigation, get a corporate mentor, or get a mentor in the Sydney office if you're in Melbourne, etc. So you've got some other bandwidth and some distance and some new voices and perspectives to influence you and guide you.
Can I ask another really interesting question that I think follows on from this rather well? And that is, we've talked in the last little while about the increased appetite to work from home, sustained increased appetite to work from home. And the question challenged us to think, what are the implications for the tacit transfer of knowledge? And in that sponsorship arrangement that or relationship that you've just outlined, you've got formal transfer of knowledge, but we also have tacit transfer between those who are more expert than the more junior members of an organisation almost continually. How does that survive and or thrive in a very differently operating working world?
So I'll just answer that quickly, and then I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say, Joel. One of the things that I started noticing with a lot of my clients about 3 to 4 months into the COVID period was most of my clients were really surprised at two things. That when people were working exclusively from home, productivity increased. I think that surprised a lot of people. And efficiency increased. But the thing that they also noticed, particularly over time, was that the quality of work decreased. And it was simply because they didn't have that on-the-job learning. So more proficient, more productive, more efficient, but over time the quality was deteriorating. So I personally think there is absolutely no substitute for on-the-job, side-to-side, learning because you're working next to a more senior practitioner. I don't think we can replace that in an online scenario. I'm interested in your perspective, Joel. You might have a different view on that.
No, look, and and it is anecdotal at this time, but my feedback that I've got from those in law firms particularly is that the junior lawyers have suffered the most in this COVID period because of this lack of supervision, that lack of serendipitous learning, just being hauled into a particular meeting or just participating in a whole range of different activities, which is just the normal life when you're in the office.
Yeah.
And there's so much of that learning happens that way. And they've, in this sort of work from home model, they've, out of sight, out of mind, they're just forgotten and certainly not given the kind of guidance and supervision and feedback that's there. So I think it's one of the main reasons firms will just never go to a full-time virtual model. I just think that they will always have, 60, 70% in the office to ensure, one, there's the social fabric is retained, the sense of tribe and belonging and social cohesion of the organization is retained. You need to, I think, come together to have that. But also critically, this apprenticeship model, which we still have, doesn't work if everyone's just working completely independently, remotely. It just, how do you be an apprentice without someone giving you that feedback and guidance and supervision, and it's just not there.
Okay, because the second limb to the question was, what can firms do to address this? And I think you're talking about hybridity in work practice at a minimum to try and hedge against losing that transfer of tacit knowledge. Can I ask you a different question? How can lawyers learn to be and lead for an innovation mindset when it's not necessarily their default mode of thinking? Rodney, that seems to cause you great amusement. Would you like to go first?
Oh, it's such a good question, Pip. I think it's because I think it's one of the great struggles of professional services firms. And I must say that, I wish I had a more positive answer, but I have struggled. I've seen people put in innovation officers and they've, heads of innovation. And I will say that I've seen some firms do amazingly innovative things. In terms of, building other capabilities, adding in new services, putting in, new ways of dealing with technology. So there's been a lot of innovation, but the innovation has been within the mindset of the productivity model. So although it's innovative, what I see is largely it just replicates the same sort of model, but in different ways. I go back to Joel's, lovely analogy of, law firms being built around a productivity model and a mindset. So the innovation is a little bit like Einstein's thing, if you want to get something different, you've got to think from a different perspective. I think the real challenge for professional services firms is how do you be innovative and create a different way of seeing your role and the potential of the way in which your firm can be structured and organized in a new and different way. And Joel, I'd love to hear if you've seen examples of that, but I'd have to really think hard before I could say I've seen one that's doing well in that space.
You have an example, Joel?
Yeah, look, I do, in a sense that to sort of lump everyone into one bucket, I think is a bit unfair. And so what you do see in many slightly larger organizations is you do have groups of early adopters or people who are looking at different ways. And it could be young and old, not just, the young, tech savvy digital natives that are sort of looking to innovate. And some of the old, I've seen it across the board, but there's people who are naturally curious. They're open to doing things differently and working differently. And they've sort of almost sometimes just taken it on their own to pioneer particular projects or a client solution, or experiment with a new technology, and sort of taken something quite not small but manageable, and do it, get a win, get a positive outcome, and let that snowball or grow from there. And so, you look at some of the major firms now, out of the e-discovery teams, the paralegal e-discovery teams, out of this has come these major parts of these firms looking at, alternative legal service provision, big. So, one firm, Herbert Smith Freehills here in Melbourne, for example, they've got an ALT centre in St Kilda Road, 110 people, combination of lawyers, paralegals, legal technologists, and it's very different to Herbert Smith Freehills, Collins Street, 101 Collins. But, that's a very establishment firm that's, built this major new entity, and it's, it sort of sprung up from the existing system, and it really, through the leadership of a few key individuals, the support of the managing partner, the leadership team, it's been able to build something from within a fairly conservative, established model. So there is hope, but it often starts from the early adopters and those who are naturally curious, are willing to take a few risks, and that's where it sort of seems to have had the biggest effect.
Okay, I've got two very quick questions for you. One is, what's a step a firm could take to improve the leadership of its people? Or maybe two steps if you need more than one.
I don't know, Rodney, if you want to go first, but what comes to mind is really having a recognition of leadership as a critical aspect of success. That actually it's a foundation capability or skill or muscle that's going to help the firm sustain its performance over time. And so having the understanding of an appreciation of it, talking about it, understanding what it is, and making some kind of assessment of where there's strength and weakness, what's the potential, how they think about the roles, how they think about development, about careers, start that conversation. So if there was
call it out as a priority.
That's exactly right. Start that conversation would be my, off the top of my head, response.
Okay, and then the last question really takes us to our current context. And thank you very much, questioner, for being so patient, because it came in first. And that is, Victoria's the only state in Australia in stage 4 lockdown. And do you believe there will be differences or demands made of leaders in Victoria coming out of that won't necessarily be replicated across the country?
Rodney, do you have a...
That's such a good question. My sense is, my intuitive answer is that the answer is yes, there will be. I'm not sure I could say at this stage what that will be. But I have a sense that there will be some differences, simply because, and I think that's already happening in the sense of the impact already on the mental and emotional health of people in Melbourne, simply because of the extended period of lockdown. That is already having an impact. It's already changing the way in which local leaders inside Melbourne organisations are needing to respond, compared to Brisbane, which is largely almost back to normal. So I think it's already having an impact.
Joel, do you want a word on that?
I don't think it's going to have my intuitive feeling is that it's not going to be materially different over the medium to long term.
I've been looking for something on which you didn't agree all the last hour, and it's just come in the last 2 minutes. So a wonderful, wonderful question, and we'll have to pick that up another time. Can I thank you both, Joel Barolsky and Rodney Howard? It's been an absolute pleasure to spend an hour with you this afternoon. Can I just advise our participants that on Tuesday the 27th of October at 11, we've got a webinar looking at an Australian International Commercial Court a quixotic concept or a necessity, where the Honourable Chief Justice Marilyn Warren, ACQC Doug Jones and John Sharkey, both professors with an association at the law school, will discuss whether Australia can harness the nationwide skills of its commercial judges and present a national offering to assist with disputation. But really, it's been an absolute pleasure, Joel and Rodney. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to all of those who have joined us this afternoon. Have a wonderful time. Cheers.